And thank you, Copyright Clearance Centre, for providing us with the means to be able to host these webinars and make them public. So welcome to the last OASPA Scholarship webinar before the summer break, at least if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. We've got over more than 430 registered participants today, and they're still arriving. So we're over 182 at the moment, so they will continue to come on. We've got a bumper session this time, but it's basically going to be, if you've been on webinars before, it's a similar format, except it's a bit longer. And so we're going to have all the presentations one after the other within the first hour, and that gives people the opportunity to leave who have to. And then we're going to have a half hour if we need it, or up to a half hour for questions. So please do add your questions to the chat, and remember there'll be speakers coming afterwards, and we will try and field your questions. My co-chair is Claire Redhead, who's the Executive Director of OASPA, and she will also be helping to field the questions, as indeed will be the panelists. And so without more ado, we're on to, I think, one of the most interesting and important topics around open access and open science, which is the role of scholarly societies. I think they play an absolutely fundamentally important part in scholarly communications. They occupy a sort of unique place because they are made up of researchers, they are often publishers, and they are sometimes funded as well. And this makes the situation for them very complicated in terms of transitioning to OA. So we might not have all the answers for you today, but we would like to start and open up the conversation about how scholarly societies might transition to OA. And we've got Aileen Fyfe, Professor of Modern History at the University of St Andrews, who's going to give us some historical context. Stuart Taylor, who's the Publishing Director of the Royal Society, and he's going to provide us with more case study from the Royal Society. And Alicia from Information Power, she's going to talk about a survey and work she's doing, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust and UKRI and ALPSP and others, I think, about Plan S. So that's very European, but it's specifically about how societies might transition to open access and talk about different models. And then Rachel Sandberg, who has got up incredibly early, although she says she gets up early anyway, but it's 7 o'clock in Berkeley, California at the moment. She's going to present the work of a group that's now calling themselves Transitioning Society Publishers to OA, that's based in the States. And that's more about resources and support for societies that want to do this. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Aileen. Thank you very much, Aileen, and over to you.
Just going to check my slides are moving, which they're not at the moment. Hang on.
Just place your cursor in the slide, Aileen, and then just hit the page down button.
I am, but oh, there they go. Sorry. Right, thank you, everybody. So I'm a historian of science by training, and I spent the last few years of my research career investigating the history of the world's oldest and longest running scientific journal. And that's the Philosophical Transactions. It started in 1665 and it's still being published to this day by Stuart at the Royal Society in London. And I found looking at its long history a really valuable source of perspective on contemporary issues in scholarly publishing, whether that's things like the way research is evaluated or the financing of research publications, a whole range of different things. But it's very clear to me that learned societies play an important and very special role in academic publishing. Part of that is historical, which I'll be telling you about, of course, but it's also because of their connection to communities of scholars. In the 1950s, that role was expressed in terms of guardianship. So here is the former Executive Secretary to the Royal Society in 1957, talking about how scientific societies, but do feel free to parse that as scholarly or learned societies, but how societies should be the guardians of the quality of scholarly publication, of original work, of research publication. That's the important point here. And he was absolutely convinced that societies must continue to dominate in journal publication, otherwise the welfare of the scholarly community would suffer. So that's to give you a bit of a hint as to why I think it's interesting to look historically at these matters. But by the time Martin was talking in the late 1950s, learned societies had already been dominating the publication of research since, well, for almost 300 years now. The story starts in 1665 with the launch of the Philosophical Transactions by a man called Henry Oldenburg in close association with the then fledgling Royal Society of London. But it was followed by the creation of other academies and other societies in other European countries who all also had their memoir, their transactions, their journals. And as we move into the 18th century, we see more and more expansion, more journals, more academies. You've got there on the screen London, Stockholm, Buenos Aires, and Cape Town by the time we get to the end of the 19th century. And as well as geographical expansion, there's also expansion in the academies and journals and societies in terms of disciplines. So you're starting to get societies and journals for geology, for microscopy, for chemistry, for physics, for history, for philology, for sociology, and so forth. And by the time we get into the middle and end of the 20th century, having some form of learned society or subject association or network or whatever you want to call your grouping of scholars, having one of those groupings and a journal had become one of the classic markers of an academic discipline. Now, it's true that there were a small number of independent journals that weren't associated with one of those communities of scholars, but there really weren't very many of them until we get to about the 1950s and 60s. So through the 18th, the 19th, and the early 20th century, learned societies, in the broadest sense of that word, really did dominate the publication of original research in all fields of scholarship. What those different types of organisations had in common, because some of them were royal academies, some of them were societies of members who got together, but they were all, in some sense, communities of scholars, and they all had as their main mission a dedication to scholarship. Publishing was often something they did, but it was almost never the main thing they did. It was something that was not the primary goal, but was the auxiliary goal to helping the main goal of scholarship. And what that incidentally means is that the purpose of publishing was not focused solely on making money. And that's an important point for the discussion that we're going to be having for the rest of today. Until we get to the Second World War, learned societies worked with a very different financial model from the one that we're used to. It might be really difficult for us to imagine, but in the 18th, the 19th, and the early 20th century, it was taken for granted that the production and circulation of research couldn't possibly be funded by sales. And here you've got the rather eminent physicist Lord Rayleigh in the 1890s explaining to the UK government why it was just not possible to imagine that scholarly journals could be profitable. As he told the Treasury, even though the contributors were paid nothing for their contributions, the problem was that the expenses were so great and the paying public was so small, and as for adverts, it's not worth mentioning, that journal publication was carried on with difficulty and at a loss. He wasn't denying that there were some sales, but there was no hope that they would be enough to cover costs. And what that meant was that you couldn't expect the circulation of specialist research to be undertaken by private enterprise, by companies in it for money. Rather, it was the preserve of organisations with a mission for scholarship. Organisations like the Royal Society, like the Continental Academies, like all the many subject associations around the world. Those kinds of organisations. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Royal Society was part of a global network, largely European and North American, but with becoming global network of learned institutions who sponsored the publication and circulation of research. Vast numbers of copies of research journals were distributed at discounted prices and indeed for free through these networks. If we take the Royal Society's publications, for instance, and that's the map you're looking at right now, that shows you who in 1908 was getting the Royal Society journals for free. And that includes shipping, by the way, as well as production costs. And you can see that it's pretty extensive globally. What we're talking about here is not just members of the society, but also other learned institutions around the world, and also quite a lot of university libraries, and even some public libraries were receiving these journals without having to purchase them. And I'd suggest that this is an early form of almost print-based open access, if you will. It's certainly making research available to the end users for free using the library system, organised and funded by the learned societies. So let us return, please, to the 1950s, when I talked about that notion of societies as being guardians of scholarship, being something quite important. Why was it that people in the 50s were starting to think there was something special about learned societies? After all, they had been publishing science and scholarship for centuries. They've got quite unique governance structures, which means they endure, and they protect that mission for scholarship, whereas with certain other forms of structure, those things might not be true, but they're also linked to communities of scholars. It means they're going to be invested in the discipline or field, and it also means they've got privileged access to something quite special, the expertise of the members in that subject group. It was assumed in the 1950s and 60s that commercial publishers couldn't possibly get access to the expertise, for instance, for peer review. That's a later development, but that's also another story. I want to get you thinking about why did it seem in the 1950s and 60s that there was a need for societies to protect scholarship. Where I'm going with this is to argue that there was an earlier transition in learned society publishing, that we're not facing the first one just now. What we're facing right now is the result of something that happened in the 1950s and 60s. What was happening around this time was, this is David Martin again, that several commercial publishing houses had realised there was quite a bit of money to be made. People like Pergamon Press, North Holland Publishing, Elsevier, these kinds of organisations who were beginning to enter into the business of journal publishing. And the worry for the learned societies was that the commercial houses had another aim in life, and it was possible that their pursuit of profit might mean that their interests were not aligned with scholarship. Though you'd have to say in the 50s there wasn't actually any evidence of how this would work out, but there was that fear that it might be. So that's why David Martin was arguing that societies were really important. But he wasn't just doing this out of he was doing it out of self-interest rather, because he was also trying to justify and defend the role of societies, which were under threat not only because Pergamon Press and so on were getting organised, they were also under threat from their own inability to cope with the expanding finances of scholarly publishing in the post-war era. In other words, learned society finances in the 1950s were struggling. The way they resolved that leaves us with the situation that we've got today. Because in the late 50s and early 60s, there was a large amount of work happening, certainly in Britain, and differently in America, but there's a similar thing in America. But a lot of work trying to transition learned societies to a more sustainable model of publishing, if you want to put it in modern terms. The movement then was called Self-Help for Learned Journals, a booklet of that title published in 1963. It was funded by the Nuffield Foundation with support from the Royal Society, and it involved a consultant from the publishing industry going around and helping dozens of learned societies. And I can see Alicia smiling because yes, this is your predecessor. But this helped dozens of UK learned societies, and the end result of that, well, you're going to see in a moment. But why was self-help necessary? You can see from the quote, they were really worried that learned society publishing was about to go under, and it's nothing to do with open access at that point in time. The key is to look at how learned society journals had been financed. So here's your quick trip through how the Royal Society journals had been financed as an example. In the 18th and 19th century, the answer to how you finance the production, the circulation of scholarly journals was basically society funds. Membership fees, income from endowments if you've got them. That's the main one for the Royal Society. If you're lucky, perhaps you occasionally get gifts and grants and donations. You have a couple of sales, but it's probably not anything big. And that worked through the 18th and the 19th century. But by the end of the 19th century, the problem was that scholarship was growing. More and more people were doing research and trying to publish research, and it was getting difficult for the Royal Society and for other learned societies. With the result, in the 1890s, the Royal Society wrote to the UK government on behalf of all the learned societies asking for government support for scholarly publishing, and specifically for society scholarly publishing. And they were successful in getting that. So by the time we look at the first half of the 20th century, we're looking at a world where society journals are still supported by society funds if they've got them, but there's also a government grant in the UK that was supporting society publications. The Royal Society was also fortunate to have a bit of industrial sponsorship from ICI, thank you very much, and they had a few more sales, still not huge. One of the interesting things about the UK context is the existence of that government grant, I think, explains why the UK learned societies didn't go for page charges around about this time, whereas some of the big American societies did. It was an alternative way of dealing with the problem that learned societies were facing. But what you're looking at then is in the years leading up to the Second World War, something that we might call a coalition, an amalgam, a patchwork, if you will, of different income sources that were supporting learned society publishing. And this is all managed and focused through the learned societies. However, by the time we get to the Second World War, this was under strain again, because science hadn't stopped growing, scholarship was continuing to expand, publications was continuing to grow, and it was becoming difficult again to sustain that. And so that's why in the 1950s we have those worries about the existence of learned society publishing. What the experts recommended in the late 50s and early 1960s was more attention to sales income, more attention to subscriptions income. You remember in the 1890s it had been assumed this wasn't possible because there were so few paying customers. But what had changed was basically the early years of the Cold War. In a time when there was very generous funding for research and for research institutions, and that includes university libraries, then there was the possibility to sell more copies of your journals and to do so internationally, actually, which was also important. This was, of course, why some of the commercial players had become interested in research journals, but it also offered a possible solution for learned society publishing. So by targeting research institutions across the world, both commercial publishers and the learned societies were able to make a success of a sales-driven, a commercial model of publishing in the later decades of the 20th century. And what they discovered, of course, is that sales income could not merely cover the costs of production and circulation, but in fact do more than that and free up funds, create funds for all sorts of other activities if you want. But notice one of the other consequences of this picture you see in front of you, where I'm trying to represent that the growth of sales income has also coincided with the disappearance of those other sources of funding that used to exist. They were either, those funding sources either dried up or were transferred to other purposes. And I think that, if you will, the disappearance of the other sources or the over-reliance on sales income, however you want to phrase it, helps to explain why open access, which in so many ways seems like a very welcome return to the traditional society ambitions of circulating research widely and non-commercially, but why open access seems like a threat to society publishing. I'd like to leave you with the thought that I don't think it is a threat to learned society publishing per se, but it does threaten a very particular model of society publishing, and that was a model that was created in the very particular economic and political context of the early Cold War. And I'd also ask you to remember that societies have long lives. They did things differently in the past, and I have absolutely no doubt they will do things differently in the future. And that's for the rest of my colleagues to tell you about in the rest of this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aileen. If Aileen has written with some others a detailed white paper about the history of scholarly publishing, untangling academic publishing, that's also in our reading list. I think it's really important that societies stick around. We need them. And so I hope that this transition will be as smooth and as rapid as possible. So next we're going to have a case study actually on the, and we're going to focus on the Royal Society as it is today. And I'd like to welcome Stuart Taylor. Stuart doesn't have a camera on his computer, so you can't see him, but if you'd like to see him, he's a very, very nice looking chap. His photo is on the bio on the OASPA webinar. Thanks, Stuart.
Aileen for that very nice historical introduction, which has saved me a few slides, and has pointed out to people, I think, that open access is not simply something of the digital age, but was going on quite a long time ago. So I'm going to pick up from where it did start, really, for us at least, which was in the year 2005, which was a significant year, at least in the UK, for open access, because Wellcome introduced their mandate and RCUK made their position statement also. Our journals at the time were subscription only, and so this resulted in an open letter from a number of our fellows to the president of the society saying that we really ought to adopt open access. And so, sure enough, the following year we adopted a hybrid model for all our journals. We set an APC based on trying to replace the revenue that we got at the time for the journals just by dividing income by number of articles, which I think is how many of the early experiments started. Our open access was using the CC BY license and involved us depositing papers for authors in PubMed Central. At the time we decided that that APC was too high, so we lowered it to a more, what you might call, market price of £1,400 in 2010. Also in 2010, we launched our first open access journal, Open Biology, and our second in 2014, Royal Society Open Science. So today we have 8.
Stuart, sorry for interrupting, but
can you not hear me all right?
No, I can hear you fine, just can't see your slides.
Oh my God, sorry, yes, I'd forgotten that. I'm in charge of the button. Yeah,
You're in charge of the button, yeah, thanks.
Good point. So that's just what I've said to you there. So we have 8 hybrid journals and 2 OA journals. that's how things have grown since that time, since 2006, and you can see there's been a pretty prodigious rise in open access for us, and we're now actually at almost 50% OA, so last year just under 50% of our articles were immediately OA. No doubt this speed of this rise is partly reflects our subject spread, because we're about 2/3 biological sciences, where OA is obviously more established. So in general, I mean, our approach really has been that we've tried not to force the system in any direction. We've got a global audience of authors and readers, and open access is moving at very different speeds around the world. And it's clear that APCs are simply not feasible in many countries and in many subjects. It's also worth saying that we've got 3 journals that are mostly commissioned content, so that makes it a bit more difficult to have a purely APC-based system. What we have tried to do, though, is to be as flexible as we possibly can as each new open access mandate comes into force, because we don't want to have to turn any authors away, either because they want OA, we want to be able to offer them that, or because they don't or can't afford OA. And actually, still, most of the world is in that position. They're not under a mandate, and they often don't have the funds for open access. So our policy up to now has been to be, as I say, as flexible as possible, to make sure that our authors and readers are the primary consideration rather than any particular business model. Also worth pointing out, our latest adaptation, if you like, to the changing mandate landscape is green open access. Under Plan S, there are only 2 routes of compliance for hybrid journals, and 8 of ours are hybrids after all. That's to have them as part of a transformative deal, or to allow authors to post their accepted manuscript in a repository with no embargo and with a CC BY license. The first of those is very difficult actually for small publishers, and even at our size, we're a sort of small to medium-sized publisher, it's very difficult indeed to get transformative deals up and running, at least sort of around the world. So instead, what we've done is taken, for the time being, the green route as, if you like, a workaround to make sure that we don't have to say goodbye to any authors following Plan S. We will lose their APC income, and that's a significant amount of money, but at least we won't have to lose them, because they can still publish paywalled with us, provided they follow the green route. Worth pointing out, we had already got a policy that allowed green open access without embargo, as indeed many publishers already do, and there is a link at the bottom to a tally I'm keeping of who does that already. If you want to click on that later, you can see that list of publishers. So all we had to do actually was to be explicit about license, in that we allowed a CC BY license on that green deposit. So just zooming out a bit from open access itself, more to open science, which is the title of my talk. It's worth pointing out that we also have a very active science policy team here who advise policymakers on all sorts of aspects of science, both science for policy and policy for science. And we work very closely with them to make sure that our science policy positions, which are summarized there, some of them are summarized there, are also in line with our publishing activity. We want to essentially walk the walk rather than just talking the talk and telling other people what we think about open science. And so we are very active in these areas. One of the most prominent reports was in 2012, which was about open data. And we often give evidence on research integrity and open science generally in the UK and in Europe. In 2015, we celebrated the 350th anniversary of the world's first science journal, which obviously Aileen was talking about earlier on, Philosophical Transactions. And we had, as a part of that year of celebration, we had a 4-day multi-stakeholder discussion looking at all aspects of scholarly publishing and how the landscape was changing and what the future might look like. When we looked at all that and the outcomes from it, we found that they fell very much into 2 broad groups. The first was about the research assessment and reward system in science, which is obviously very heavily based on publication, and the second was issues around transparency. And so really this got us thinking about the sorts of things that we might want to do in the journals to try and take some of these issues forward. And the first of these, actually, the research assessment reward structure came out very strongly in all aspects of the 4 days as being a big issue for science generally. And actually holding back open science initiatives and open access. So following that, we embarked on a program of introducing a number of initiatives in our journals to try and take forward some of these issues. I've listed them there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll pick out a few of them. So right away, we did a few of the early things, which was to introduce author contribution statements, which obviously many journals already had, but also to introduce registered reports in our newest journal, which is a way of pre-registering studies before you have the results, to try and make sure that you're reducing publication bias as much as possible. And then in successive years, we introduced an ORCID mandate for our authors. That was we were the first publisher to do that. We also encouraged preprints for our authors to make sure that early versions of work was being shared widely, and that was already well established in the physical sciences, obviously, but was beginning to take off in the biological sciences. And then gradually we've been also adopting open peer review in our journals, strengthening our data policy, having mandatory data availability statements for all articles. And open peer review is actually now operating on 4 of our journals, and it's mandatory on 3. And by mandatory, I mean the sharing of the peer review reports is mandatory. The identities of the reviewers is still something that we allow reviewers to choose, so that's optional. But we're getting an appreciable take-up of that, I would say. And then most recently, we've introduced an accountable replication policy, which encourages and invites scientists to try and replicate work that we've already published in our journals. And we've already published the first 2 of those. So you can see that after our sort of 4-day thing in 2015, we came up with quite a lot of ideas which we can actually put into place in the journals as a way of trying to take forward open science. And finally, I just want to talk about another initiative regarding societies, which is that towards the end of last year, a number of learned society publishers got together to form what is now called the Society Publishers Coalition, which is really a group of learned societies who share an aim to try and get towards an open future sustainably. We've currently got about 37, 38 members. Roughly a third of them are self-publishing. 2/3 are with commercial partners. And we're really trying to get together to see if we can come up with some collaborative solutions to the challenges that we all face, and to compare notes on how we might be solving some of those challenges, but also to get together to try and get a seat at the table for things like transformative agreements and talking to funders. And one of the things we've already been doing is actually talking to Plan S. We've had a few meetings with them already. And potentially looking into ways that we might make hybrid journals compliant with Plan S, for example, if we can get them to show good faith in terms of double dipping and pricing and so on, and transparency. We're also very keen to work with other groups, and we're working with Rachel's TSPOA, and she may mention that later on. So that's about it from me, I think. I hope I'm in time.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Stuart. As far as I know, the Royal Society have now more than 50% of their publications open access, which for a society transitioning their own journals is the highest that I know of in the world.
Yeah, I think I showed that graph. At least I hope I did.
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
So at one level, the Royal Society is the most radical open access society publisher we know. So now we're going to go on. I wanted to say 2 things. First of all, please start putting your questions in the chat room. None of the other participants can see them. You can ask exactly what you like, but if they all come at the end, we'll get swamped. So please do that. So now I'm going to hand over to Alicia, and she'll explain what she's doing. Thanks very much, Alicia.
Thanks, Katrina, and hello, everyone. I'm going to talk to you today about a project called Society Publishers Accelerating Open Access in Plan S. It was launched in January, funded, as Katrina said earlier, by the Wellcome Trust and UKRI, which is a UK funding body, and done in partnership with ALPS, which is a trade association representing learned society publishers. And since January, we've been doing a number of things. I'm just going to give you some of the top highlights today because we don't have a lot of time. But what we have been doing are interviews in depth with publishers, representatives of library consortia, and funder representatives. We've then done 2 surveys, one of library consortia around the world and one of society publishers. And that society publisher survey was really focused on a wide array of potential business models that they could use to transition their hybrid journals and their portfolios to full immediate open access. We've run 2 workshops, and we've participated in a number of others, not only here in the UK, but also in Europe, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in the United States. And right now we are working on a model transformative agreement and an implementation toolkit. But I'm not going to say very much about that today because it's very much a work in progress. So let me give you the highlights from the survey of library consortia. We circulated this with the help of the International Coalition of Library Consortia, and we were delighted to have 26 responses back. We did try to get worldwide coverage, but we've only managed coverage in the Northern Hemisphere. And you can see the list of countries represented. So quite strong responses from Europe, but also North America and Asia Pacific. And we were really asking whether library consortia were interested in working with learned society publishers on open access transitions. And if so, what would they look to be achieving? What would their objectives be for that kind of partnership? And the really encouraging news for society publishers is that there was a very strong positive response. Over 75% of our respondents said that they were very likely or likely to repurpose existing subscription expenditure to support open access transition by society publishers. And they also flagged up that they see this as a strategic, almost historic strategic opportunity. They are really keen to co-create the new models that emerge in this landscape with learned society publishers and other small and medium-sized publishers, OA publishers as well, like Hindawi, Katrina. The idea here is that there is a need to have more equitable approaches that are scalable for all stakeholders, sustainable for all stakeholders. And the idea that came through loudly and clearly from the library consortia is that they see the OA transition as an exciting opportunity to do that co-creation. So I'm not going to say anything more about the consortia survey. There is a lot more detail. We've just had a paper accepted for the journal Insights. It will be published in September, and that goes into a lot of detail focusing on the results of the consortia survey. Instead, today I'm going to transition over, pivot, and tell you a little bit more about the society survey that we did. So we had 105 responses. The majority, around 65, were from learned societies based in the UK. We also had a sizable number, 23 respondents from the US. And then we had a handful of Chinese learned societies and a handful of European societies. We also had 2 societies that were hard to categorize. One is international. Apparently their headquarters changes depending on where their current president is located. So they're very variable. I didn't know how to map them. And another respondent based in the Netherlands is actually an umbrella body representing 30 learned societies in different countries around the world. But this gives you a flavor for where the information was coming from. Now, this is a very busy slide. We're preparing a full article on the Society Publisher Survey, and we're planning to submit that to Learned Publishing. We don't know if it will be accepted, obviously, but if these busy slides are hard to unpack in the short time available today. Do please know that our full project report and that article will be coming in due course. So to give you some insight into the societies that responded to us, in the top right corner of this slide, you can get a sense for whether or not our respondents were self-publishing or whether they partner with a larger publisher of some kind. So we see here the differences between STEM subjects, humanities and social sciences. We had a respondent who described themselves as other, and a few respondents who were a blend of STEM and HSS. And one disciplinary difference you can see quite clearly is that more of the STEM publishers are in blue. They were self-publishing, and relatively few of the humanities and social science publishers are still self-publishing. So that is a difference to keep in mind as we go through. The slide on the lower left corner asks about the transition status of the portfolio of journals that these publishers have. And we expected at the outset that there would be a real gap between STEM publishers and humanities and social science publishers with more open access experience in the STEM subjects. But we were surprised that that wasn't actually the case. A little bit more experience in the STEM areas, amongst our respondents anyway, but there wasn't the huge gap that we perhaps were anticipating. So just to guide you quickly through that chart, the colored bars to the left signal that the publisher has traveled further on their OA transition journey. If they've got a green bar, only one of the STEM publishers did, they're already fully open access. The blue and yellow bars show that most or all of the journals are already hybrid or fully OA. If you see bars that look more purpley, that suggests that some of the journals in the publisher's portfolio haven't yet begun to offer open access options. Okay, so what were we actually asking these society publishers about? We had created a discussion document which surfaced more than 25 business models that can be used to transition to open access. We clustered these into 7 buckets, which are listed on the screen in front of you to the left. And we were going through each of the models systematically and asking if they had experience of trying them, what they thought if so, whether they were open to it, whether they thought they would work, and importantly, what support they would need from other stakeholders to try these models and to make them work. And I'll go through each one in turn. But let me say something about article processing charges before I start, because this has been an area of sort of systematic confusion, if you will, throughout the project. Many of the stakeholders we were engaged with, particularly publishers, equated the open access publishing transition with the need to transition to the APC business model for recovering costs, for charging for it. And that is not the connection you should have in your mind as we go through the rest of these models very quickly. The majority of the models we surfaced do not involve author payment fees, and they don't involve article level transactions either. And that might be important and empowering for ways I'll try to explain. Okay, so the first bucket of models, which emerged very clearly as being of the most interest to both society publishers and the library consortia, are these transformative models that take current subscription spend and repurpose it to fund open access publishing. The second category of models are cooperative infrastructure and funding. These are really deep strategic partnerships between libraries and publishers to co-create platforms on which content is hosted, to jointly provide peer reviewing and dissemination services, and to do joint funding. The third set of models are around the green open access route, the route that Stuart will be using as a transition model in the short term. So immediate sharing of accepted manuscripts or final published articles under CC BY license. The fourth, article transaction models. So this is where APCs come in. We were also exploring interest in the potential use of submission models. submission payment models. Fifth are open publishing platforms, things like Faculty of 1000, which actually let the author decide when they're ready to disseminate their article, and then peer review happens post-publication and can be done in various ways. Other revenue models, if you can think of it, it's in that bucket. We looked at crowdfunding, we looked at endowments, we looked at subsidies of all kinds. So there's quite a lot of rich variation in there. Probably none of those are sufficiently stable and scalable to replace the steady, predictable revenue stream that most society publishers get from subscriptions at the minute. And finally, we looked at cost reduction. So let me just focus in the time remaining on transformative agreements. So there are 5 of these models operating at present in the marketplace. So you might have heard read and publish agreements or publish and read agreements, wondering what the difference is between them. There is a model that's been getting a lot of attention this year by annual reviews called Subscribe to Open. And essentially what all of these models are doing are repurposing subscription spend to support open access publishing. They all are workable, they're scalable, but there's some practical challenges that need to be addressed to help them scale and grow. And this is the reason for the rest of our project we'll be focusing on developing a transformative agreement toolkit. We're piloting that with 4 publishers and 4 library consortia with the aim of launching it in September. But let me describe to you visually very quickly why transformative agreements are appealing from a library perspective. And here I'm borrowing some slides that were kindly shared with me by colleagues at the Max Planck Digital Library. They did an exercise where they mapped out where all of their authors were publishing. And they identified these 20 publishers as resulting in the lion's share of articles published. And you'll see a fairly big slice of the pie, actually, up in the top left corner, marked Others. A lot of society publishers will sit in the Others slice. And Max Planck decided that its strategy was to enter into transformative agreements with as many of these publishers as possible in order to flip all of their output to open access. So 5 publishers easy, because they're fully open access already. But by 2017, Max Planck Digital Library had already entered into 4 transformative agreements with different sorts of publishers, finding their way forward in this landscape. And in place for the start of next year, you can see now that the majority of these pie slices are beginning to be filled in gray, indicating that there are transformative agreements in place, including, I'm pleased to see, some of the other slices, which is really encouraging. They're actively in discussion with some publishers, including, I think, in the Society Publishers Coalition now. So there's more to come. This final slide is just an illustration of all of the countries we have been able to identify that have at least one transformative agreement in place. And I had to edit it yesterday because you might have seen that the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia announced their first transformative agreement with the Royal Society of Chemistry. So this is a fast-growing model. Watch this space, very interesting and quite a promising transition strategy and transition model for society publishers. Thanks, Katrina. Sorry I overran it.
That's great. No, it's fine. We've got Rachel. We're going to overrun the hour slightly to give Rachel a bit of time. So we're probably going to go 3 minutes past the hour to ensure that Rachel has enough time for her presentation. I just want to make one point clear before that all the PowerPoints will be available, as will be the audio recording of this session. So they're freely available. If you're using information from the slides, please be sure to attribute the panelists appropriately. And also I want to point out there's another webinar that we had a webinar in particular about the consortial cooperative funding model for publishing. And one of the most famous ones of these is the Open Library of Humanities, run by Martin Eve. And he was on the webinar along with John Walensky, who was looking at a sort of funder plus library model, and Oya Riga, who's had a lot of experience from the work at Archive in Cornell. And that's a really interesting developing area, which is a completely different way of paying for open access than ATC. So I encourage you to go back and find that. Okay, Rachel, over to you. And I will raise my hand at about 3 minutes past 4. Go for it.
So, if people could actually hear me. So transitioning society publications to open access, or TSPOA, is a group of like-minded scholarly communication workers from libraries, academic institutions, publishers, and consortia. This first year, we've capped ourselves at 15 people for agility purposes in getting our projects underway. And we mostly work at academic libraries and academic publishers within the United States, although we do have some international representation. And some of our publishers also have an international presence. We have organized to provide support, advocacy, and referral services within scholarly society publishing, and today I'm going to talk about 3 things. First, why we felt that TSPOA was needed. Second, how we formed to help address society needs. And third, what some of our current projects are. So as of January 2019, there were nearly 1,100 societies publishing roughly the same number of fully open access, non-hybrid OA journals. And as global publishing shifts towards open access, societies have been wrestling with new revenue streams and new publishing strategies, some of which Alicia mentioned, not only to ensure cost recovery, but also to sustain the many other society functions that were once supported by membership or the subscription model. For some of the TSPOA members in our own institutions, we had been observing this landscape and experimenting with how we could support society authors at our own institutions and engage with societies more directly, which is somewhat of a new approach for U.S. libraries anyway, given that direct interactions between libraries and societies in a subscription-based publishing landscape was not strictly necessary. Some of the ways in which we were engaging with societies were through local consultations with faculty on our campuses who had questions about transitioning their own society journals and generally about publishing viability for their societies. As we began engaging with our authors, we became more familiar with societies' financial landscapes and how much those needs and situations differed from society to society, and not just from discipline to discipline. So as Alicia explained, financial models to support the transition of society journals to open access present both opportunities and challenges. For instance, where authors could once publish in society journals for free, now some are being asked to contribute article processing charges, or APCs, to subsidize publication costs. And I take Alicia's point that that is not the case in all scenarios, but that is one transition approach that has been adopted. Where once libraries and research organizations engaged in large licensing arrangements to provide their affiliates with access to aggregated society journal titles, now many institutions are left exploring how to repurpose subscription budgets to support both access and publishing, including by undertaking society journal publishing directly through partnerships between the university or the library and the journals. And as Katrina mentioned, there are new publishing models like Libraria's Library Plus Funders or Annual Reviews Subscribe to Open that explore more of a collective approach to transitioning journals. Neither the societies nor the libraries necessarily have a keen understanding at this particular moment of which transition approach might be best to experiment with or adopt. So our biggest takeaways from engaging with societies and faculty editors on our campuses were three tensions felt by library societies and third-party publishers. First, there's uncertainty within societies about the viability of often emerging open access funding models. Second, societies are vulnerable to a changing landscape of publishing partners. In place of subscriptions, the societies may now have to court sustaining contributions from funders, libraries, consortia, and others. In turn, from what organizational resources will these other potential partners be able to provide societies with funding? So I have a question for Alicia at the end because her research showed that libraries are interested in engaging with societies to repurpose funds, but then when we shift to the practicalities of doing that, how does that actually happen? Because, for example, libraries are only just beginning to repurpose subscription spending through transformative agreements to support sustainable open access. And third, there's a risk that libraries are disengaged from society's value because they traditionally have not interacted directly with societies, which has led to uncertainty about how and whether libraries should support society publishing at all. Since society third-party publishers, and libraries are all experiencing these tensions, our work as individuals within our own institutions really underscored that all of us as stakeholders within society publishing are traveling in this OA transition together, and we should consider ways to better partner with and support each other. And that's really the genesis of TSPOA. We took root at the October 2018 Choosing Pathways to Open Access Working Forum held by the University of California Libraries. The forum brought together more than 125 library and consortium leaders and key academic stakeholders to engage in action-oriented deliberations about a range of OA funding strategies, with the idea that we could all leave with customized plans for how we intend to support the global transition towards openness. At that forum, a diverse group of participants expressed particular interest in providing support to trusted society publishers, given the uncertainty these publishers are facing in the current scholarly communication climate. What united us as forum participants was a desire to act, our intention to leverage our collective experience and expertise in order to yield a more open society journal universe. And so we formed TSPOA. This is our website, tspoa.org. We are OA publishing model agnostic. We are not promoting any particular OA funding model, such as collectives or article processing charges. Rather, we aim to provide relevant resources and experience working in collaboration with society publishing partners to help them develop an open access publishing model that is appropriate, effective, and sustainable for them. In doing so, we celebrate the transition guidance work already being done by our colleagues elsewhere, internationally by groups like Stuart mentioned SPC, by OA 2020 and Max Planck and ESAC, and within the United States by organizations like SPARC, ARL, and the University of California's Office of Scholarly Communication, to name just a few. Our efforts as TSPOA should complement existing undertakings and hopefully can help draw more attention to contributions in this regard. So let's get under the hood a little bit and look at what we're actually doing as part of TSPOA. Nominally, we support, pilot, consult, advocate, and report, but what this actually means is we cultivate our website to collect and offer useful tools and guidance for society journal editors and publishers, and the libraries or consortia who work with them. We will help connect those of you who contact us with localized groups and individuals, or offer consultation services directly to support you in your OA transition aims. We are evaluating opportunities to support and encourage new society journal publishing models and projects. We are advocating within professional societies through existing administrative positions or at society meetings and conducting outreach and presentations. We are working to highlight successful initiatives and partnerships, and we'll be publishing case studies. And we'll keep the scholarly publishing community up to date on our efforts with a year-end summary of our goals and accomplishments. Now, of course, we can't achieve all of this on a voluntary basis while working our day jobs and all in the first year. So I'd like to just highlight a few of our year one projects that reflect some of these services. First, our referrals and consultations. So this means helping societies and society journal editors understand their journal's current publishing situation, including ownership issues, income and revenue, operation and personnel needs, as well as their discipline's views on open access. Helping them approach a transition, so whether that's from converting publisher-owned journals to open access or society-owned journals to open access, or even leaving publisher or society-owned journals to create new open access journals. And evaluate different financial models, whether they be community or cost-based models or APC or number of article models and the like. Second, we will have collaborations and informative webinars. As Stuart referenced, in the UK, the Society Publishers Coalition has formed to help societies, funders, and research organizations collectively explore funding solutions. Like SPC, TSPOA has a desire for knowledge exchange and community building, so we recognized an opportunity to partner with SPC to bring together societies, universities, funders, and authors so that they may learn from an even wider range of experiences to help them develop their own strategies and approaches to the changing society publishing landscape. As a first effort in our collaboration with SPC, we will be partnering to bring 3 webinars to the public this fall. The first, entitled Understanding Learned Societies, is a deep dive into modern purposes, functions, and financial needs of scholarly societies, with particular attention to publishing opportunities and challenges they face. It will support strategic decision-making by libraries and research organizations as they begin the process of repurposing subscription spends to support open access publishing. The second is funding pathways for Learned Society OA publishing. The idea is once we have an understanding of what societies are doing and facing, we'll explore the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of various funding models that scholarly societies may consider in transitioning to open access. And this will also support libraries and consortia in understanding their potential roles in contributing to open access publishing. And the third webinar will address how to engage societies and society journals in making the transition. So we'll start discussing how authors and libraries can work with and support society journals and publishers in preparing for and undertaking the transition. Finally, we are in early conversations with societies to pilot multi-society and multi-library experiments that are attuned to scalability, openness, and financial sustainability. Again, really early stages here, but if you're interested, please be in touch. So please reach out to us if you edit or publish a society journal and are looking to transition to open access, or if you're working with society journal editors seeking transition support. I've said this a few times, but keep in mind we have full-time day jobs, but we're looking to help how and when we can, even by connecting you to others who provide similar support. So we're looking forward to connecting soon, and thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you very much. And dead on time. And we've still got, so even though we're over the hour, we've still got more than 180 participants for the question time. And we've got quite a lot of questions. Just one, I'm going to bring in Claire Redhead, the executive editor from, executive director of OASPA. But also, could the panelists just look through the questions as well? If you spot things that of particular interest to you or directed to you, please flag, and hopefully we'll get them all covered within the next half hour. Okay, Claire.
Hi.
Are you there?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thanks.
So firstly, quickly, thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you to all of the presenters. We have loads of questions. I don't think we'll get through all of them, but we will have a list that's sent to us afterwards, and we will follow up with them directly. So one of the things that I wanted to ask first, Rachel, you mentioned briefly in your presentation, you touched on whether library budgets should support society activities beyond publishing, and we've had a question about that as well. Now, I know this is a really tough question, but this is something that does come up a lot of the time. So do any of the panelists want to respond to that with your thoughts?
Well, I'll quickly say something just because you mentioned that it came up in my presentation. I think what we realize as TSPOA, and really the prime reason that we are partnering with SPC on these webinars, especially the first webinar, is to really kind of reintroduce what societies do, especially within North American context, where the libraries are currently a little disengaged from all of the ways that societies use their money. And I think you're going to see libraries feeling quite differently about how and whether their budgets should support these different aspects of society work. But I think the predicate is really understanding what societies do and the value they contribute in order to make informed decisions about what library spends are going to support.
So this is really, it's almost the big elephant in the room, isn't it? Because societies do a lot of really good work, and much of that is supported by journal revenue, and the fear is that they won't get the same revenue from open access. Aileen, how would you also address that one?
Well, it is the big question, isn't it? And I wonder if Alicia's actually more up-to-date stats on this, because I think there has been some work looking at what societies do actually spend their publishing revenues on. And we tend to have this assumption that societies make lots of money from their publishing that they use to sponsor their graduate students, do grants, run conferences, all those sort of things. Some societies do, but not all societies do. And I think it's one of the things we don't know enough about. But from my historical perspective, it's quite a recent phenomenon that most of the societies I've looked at or know about in the British context were still simply trying to cover their publishing costs through to the 1970s, even into the 1980s. It's the idea that you would actually use publishing to generate extra revenue for your activities is even newer than what I was talking about earlier. I know it doesn't help answer, so what are we going to do instead of that? Because we've got used to it for the last couple of decades, but it is quite a recent phenomenon. And I think it's a fair question to ask about why you would expect a library budget to support the society's PhD students in their research travel. I think somebody should be supporting those PhD students or those early career scholars or whatever it is, but should it be the library budget? But then that's a much bigger transformation and redirection of funding streams that we have to look at, which we probably do have to look at ultimately.
Stuart, from the Royal Society's perspective, how do you juggle that tension? Are you there? Have we lost him?
Me?
Yes, Stuart.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's clearly a very important question, and I do think that as we go forward, we are going to have to ask some questions of learned societies in this regard. I suppose what I would say, though, is that if libraries are paying for information resources, is it better that the surpluses from those go into shareholders' pockets or into learned societies' pockets? I think probably most people would have an answer to that one. Beyond that, I think the importance is on transparency, so that you know that what you're paying for is fair and that you're not paying twice for the same content, and so on. The other dimension to it, I would say, is the global one, which is that most societies have remits that are sort of national, unless they're European-based, for example, but many societies are nationally based anyway, but their income is coming from all over the world, so that's another complexity, I guess, in all this. But yeah, overall, I think it's a perfectly fair question. You know, we need to be looking into how learning societies are funded and what value they're providing, and so on. Yeah, sure.
Your answer there, Stuart, does lead on to one of the other questions that we've had, and this is from Megan Watcher. which was, she says, Alicia notes that libraries see an opportunity to work with learned societies to build a more equitable and accessible publishing ecosystem. However, if most of those societies aren't self-publishing, won't libraries ultimately be working with the same players that created the problem, that is, commercial vendors?
Do you want me to comment on that one, Claire?
Well,
sorry, Alicia's just about to come in.
Alicia?
Stuart, go on.
Both of you, go for it, one after the other, and then I want to chip in with one small thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, the practical fact of life, unfortunately, is that many societies, if not most societies, are too small to be able to carry on these sorts of activities themselves. You know, you need a certain amount of staff to carry out all the editorial functions, the production functions, the technical hosting, and so on, and the sales and marketing. So you know, it's simply not really an option for many societies, and I think many of them probably would prefer to be self-publishing if they possibly could. But yeah, you're right. Some of that money will be diverted into shareholders' pockets rather than into learned societies.
And here, all publishers are needing to think about how to transition to open access. If transformative agreements are going to be one of the ways that that happens, it would be unfortunate, I think, if only the larger publishers had a seat around the table and the ability to do that. That would very quickly force the independent society publishers to have to work with the larger publishers. So I think a vibrant landscape where there are choices and options for society publishers about how best to manage their publishing portfolios, what to do themselves, what to outsource or partner around, where to collaborate, and with whom, it is helpful for everyone, actually.
And I just like to chip into that because I'm here from a commercial company, and we're pure open access, and we're quite radically open in terms of infrastructure and open source as well. And I think it's less about commercial versus non-commercial in some respects. After all, libraries and institutions get lab equipment from commercial companies, etc. And it's more about how we can create a very competitive, transparent market when we have essentially a dysfunctional market at the moment that will allow innovative new players, regardless of background, to come in. But that's perhaps a discussion for another webinar.
Can I chip in here as well and say, speaking this time as someone who's a member of various learner societies, including one that is currently looking about whether or not to renew its publisher contract. And that's the moment at which you've got a bunch of academic members of a society sitting around trying to work out, do we stick with publisher A that we've been with for the last 15 years and who's been delivering a reliable, regular sum of money to fund various things, or do we go with something different? And then you've got that whole, you know, not knowing, most people in this committee not knowing enough about what to do, not knowing enough about the options. And you can easily imagine how you would go with the big name publisher that you've heard of who makes an attractive offer, because you simply don't have the time or the resources to explore all the other options on the table. And that's somewhat ironic for my society, where we actually have several of us who do work in the history of publishing sitting on this committee, but even so, we're still struggling. And yeah, what can it be like for other learning societies?
Here's one from Lisa Hinchcliffe. She said, I've heard that some society publishers say they are having to manage a lot of anti-open access sentiment among their members, among the researcher members, and so are sort of wanting to work quietly behind the scenes while they explore open access options. I mean, it implies to me as though they don't quite want to let the cat out of the bag, that that's what they'd like to do. And so there's a tension between the membership, the researchers wanting one thing, and perhaps society publishers and the publishing seeing things differently. Can we have some comments on that? Stuart? Do you have anything to say on that? And Alicia?
Well, speaking from the Royal Society's point of view, I wouldn't say that we've got anti-open access sentiments here. We've certainly got some anti-Plan S sentiments, which I wouldn't say is the same thing. But I wouldn't say we've got anti-open access sentiments. I mean, we're aware that this is the way to the future is going, and that we've got to find a sustainable solution to it. We haven't found one yet, but we're working on it.
So in talking to authors about open access over many years, I've encountered every single possible attitude, very pro, very anti, and everything in between. So in those conversations, it's often helpful to start asking questions to figure out what exactly the concern is. And I suspect in a lot of cases, it's this overconflation of open access, again, with article processing charges. If you are concerned that you're going to need to pay out of your grant revenue, maybe not only for yourself, but for all of your postdoctoral and PhD students, you may worry that you won't have that amount of grant funding available, or it's a distraction from your core research. You may be working in a social science or a humanities subject and not have a grant at all. And if you're thinking about open access as requiring you to pay APCs, that's a non-starter for you. Maybe you are coming from a country where funders aren't supporting open access, and there, again, isn't money available for APCs. So often if you tease apart the principle of having everybody in the world be able to access and read your research output immediately, you'll get support. But it's the detailed approach or the way you're implementing that can be the concern. It's really important to tease those things apart.
Okay, thank you. And apologies, Lisa, for mispronouncing your last name. It's Hinchcliffe, not Hinchcliffe. Thank you very much. There are questions. Claire, do you have some more? I noticed that we must be careful not to miss out the ones at the top.
So there were quite a few questions during Stuart's presentation. I'm going to join a couple of them together. So Stuart, there was a question about whether you experience any subscription drop-off as you see open access increasing. Do subscribers start to cancel in anticipation of a certain percentage point? And then another question relating to financing as well is also whether your APC income is now significant and whether it would be a problem for the Royal Society if open access wasn't collecting APC funds as well.
Yeah, I thought those were very interesting as well. Thanks, Claire. In terms of the drop-off in subscriptions, no, certainly we've not seen that happen. We've actually enjoyed very good renewals over the last several years, and we've had open access for, well, 13 years now, and at a significant level, so we haven't seen that yet. Now, I guess common sense would suggest that at a certain level you must start to see cancellations. What that would be, who knows? Is it 2/3? Is it 3/4? Is it higher than that? I guess what I would say to that is that by that point, we would already be wanting to flip our journals anyway. So, I mean, if we were to get to, I don't know, 75% OA, we really ought to have flipped our journals or be seriously thinking about flipping them anyway. So, but no, we haven't seen any drop-off yet. As to the other question, APC income is a very small part of the Royal Society's income. It's probably between 1% and 2%.
So can I just add to that in terms of, there was another question I asked, it's just related, that you have you allow your accepted manuscripts to be deposited in the repository without any embargo time. Has that been affecting your subscriptions at all?
No, it hasn't. I mean, we've the green compliant route which we've recently adopted is only really to change the license. We already had a zero embargo. And as I mentioned in my talk, there are a lot of publishers, I mean, over 30 that I've counted so far that have no embargo on green OA, and presumably they haven't seen it either, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. So no, we've not seen any adverse effect.
Okay, thanks. There were a couple of questions just about the sort of general, more open science aspect for societies, and in particular for around open peer review. And there's, I'm just trying to, yes, in terms of how does publishing reports, but perhaps not having the author's identity, if I'm interpreting this question correctly, help process versus a completely sort of open system where you have open identities of all the reviewers involved as well as their reports. And also that where authors also are potentially knowing who their reviewers are, you know, making sure that it's all known. Why have the Royal Society, for instance, chosen not to adopt a more open identity with their open peer review?
So we've really followed the sort of guidance that ASAP Bio came up with a few years ago when looking into this, which is to try and separate out open peer review into two things, open reports and open identities. Now, the culture in most areas of research is still that anonymity reviewers. So we felt that if we just kept the two of them together, we would actually hinder the progress of open peer review, if you like. So by separating them, because open peer review report publishing is much more widely accepted, most people have no real problem with that. We wanted to press ahead with that because that is of great value to readers in being able to see the nature of the peer review that's been done on an article, what sort of rigor it's been through, what sort of questions have been asked, that sort of thing. Even if they don't necessarily get the identity of the reviewer, which we have left as an option. We hope over time that cultural practices and disciplines will change and that will become more common, but I guess we didn't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good.
Okay, thanks. I've just spotted another question, Claire, if I can just, and then there's a question here from, I apologize if I've mispronounced your name, from Tana Kemal Erdag, who's the editor-in-chief of a Turkish archive of otorhinolaryngology. So that's, I'm sorry, I've completely befuddled that name. But he's made the very important point that in developing countries, it is difficult to get grants for research, full stop, because the grant system is not common in most universities or institutions. So authors from developing countries don't have access to pay APCs. And I think this also speaks to the idea of the sense that open access is equated with APC models. But I was thinking in particular as well, because I think that's not just a developing country issue, I think it's also an issue for the humanities, special, humanities societies. And I was wondering, Aileen, whether you would talk about that, perhaps the developing country issue and the discipline issue.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting shifts in publishing in the last 50 years or so is that shift from national to international, and it's what Stuart alluded to before about you might be a national society but you've got readers all over the world, and you've probably got authors all over the world now, and it's all very well for those of us in Europe or North America who might have funding to be sitting here thinking we can have APCs or we can find some other transformative agreements, and it's clearly much more difficult for people in other parts of the world. But one of the differences I see between the developing countries question and the humanities question is that in the case of the sciences, you could have a system, like, I mean, Stuart might say I'm mischaracterizing the Royal Society's current arrangements, but many of the Royal Society journals are hybrid at the moment. They're still getting subscriptions from the global north, but are able to offer waivers to basically most of the global south. And so you've got a scenario where those institutions who have some money can help everyone get open access, but that's not quite the same thing as in the humanities or the social sciences where there's no grants kicking around. But for me, the huge question is what's the right level of action if we're trying to get open access globally? Because you can imagine getting collective action nationally or maybe even within Europe, but how do you get this to work all over the world with a very different political and economic climate? I think it's a real problem. I think you have to hope for some form of, is it Victorian philanthropy again? But how do we avoid that being imperialistically colonial by saying, let's have Europe and North America paying for open access for everyone, and how would you then avoid free riders? I mean, these are huge questions that are not just economic, but are also political and moral questions when you start looking at the global scene.
Yeah, and I think some of the most interesting open access, new open access models are coming from South America, from Africa, from Asia, and so we do have a very Eurocentric view on this, but this is where I think that sort of a wider collaboration and understanding and learning across different geographic regions is very important. So Claire's got the next question, and then for the last 5 minutes, I was wondering if each of the panelists could choose a question that they would like to answer and answer it afterwards. So Claire, what's your...
Well, my question was going to be quite big, actually. I need to...
You might not have time to find a question.
Because I think transformative agreements are clearly, what people are seeing as a solution, but I think there's, some of the questions that we've had show some concerns about those and skepticism. So again, I'm going to perhaps, Alicia, you could start here with the work that you've been doing. Most of the currently concluded transformative agreements don't seem to lead to any savings for libraries, so that's one of the questions that we've had. Do transformative agreements lock out new publications who do not have historic subscriptions to support? That's obviously another concern. We've also talked about how the smaller publishers are going to struggle to get a seat at the table. And one other thing was a practical question. Where is the transformative agreement toolkit going to be posted in September? If you could answer that one as well, so we know.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Right, so savings for libraries. I think this is a really important issue, and it was the one that we thrashed through repeatedly in our workshop on transformative agreements, where we had consortia and society publishers and university presses. And the conclusion in that workshop, it'd be interesting to know if the rest of you agree, is that it's not going to be workable and scalable simply to transition to open access on the basis of current spend and current pricing models, which themselves are based on historic print spend, right? It's just kind of a layer upon layer upon layer of untransparent practice that's out of step, perhaps, with the modern world. But in our workshops, we recognized as well that there's a really pragmatic need for society publishers and other small and medium-sized publishers to get practical experience of transformative agreements quickly. They've got to comply with Plan S and other funder mandates by the end of 2020, so they need experience now. So it might be pragmatic in the short term to enter into these agreements on the basis of it being cost neutral, on the basis of current spend, and then work together, get librarians, get publishers around tables talking about a better basis, a more equitable, fair, and transparent basis on which to price going forward. So we'll see. Cost neutrality then is also contested. Do you go back to just subscription expenditure? Is that cost neutral? Or is it subscription expenditure plus APC payments over the last few years? So there's a lot to be resolved. Anyway, so there is the potential of savings for libraries, but I think if you dig in your heels and get it and insist on that quickly, it will slow down the speed of transition. So there are choices to be made. Lockout for new publishers with these models. No, I don't think so at all. I mean, it's expensive to launch new titles. You're not guaranteed of subscription revenue now. You're not guaranteed of any particular funding source either. You have to demonstrate that authors have an interest in your new title. You have to invest in it. Publishers fund new titles for many years in some cases. So I think that's the same going forward. How to make transformative agreements practical for small players? Well, we're trying to work that out because it's not very easy at the minute. Every consortium is used to working in a different way, and I think we're going to need to look for some models that might work across many countries, work for many libraries, and really simplify. And that's proving difficult in our pilot, so we'll see how far we get. The toolkit, I'm sure we'll be widely communicating it. At the very least, it'll be available on the Wellcome Trust open research site on Figshare. But
okay.
I would be bored of thinking about where
you
Can I add a few thoughts to complement what Alicia said around transformative agreements and also how they might work for smaller publishers? So in terms of cost savings, I'm within the University of California. You know that we're interested in transformative agreements. We have a particular model that we've put into place already with Cambridge University Press. It really comes down to something Alicia was kind of hinting at, is what is the library's intention here? Is it to support a transition, or is it to save cost? Now, transformative agreements can be done on a cost-neutral basis. It remains to be seen, I think, to some extent about whether they can also save money, but the question is, what are you using as the benchmark for what the spend should be, and that does need to be reevaluated and revisited. In addition to the fact that, you know, cost neutrality doesn't have any objective meaning. Does cost neutrality mean that you're also taking into account the inflation, the average inflation that the publisher would have been charging you from year to year anyway, or is it just we pick this point in time and we maintain this price from here on out? So it really kind of comes down to how the library is defining things. One thing I've started to see on the point of the ability of smaller society publishers to participate in transformative agreements, because again, there's a really wide range of things that can be considered transformative. If we stick with the definition of transformative of repurposing subscription spends to support OA, one thing is that the small society publishers can work with a diverse group of libraries who might contribute based on the publishing at their institution. So to be determined, but I think we have to be creative here.
Okay, we are, and that is a big question, so we're running out of time, but I want to give the last word to Aileen to talk about, because societies are very different sizes, but also the impact on smaller societies as well of transformative agreements and that sort of thing.
Well, I've been wondering, listening to my colleagues talking, thinking the sort of societies I'm involved in are small societies. I still think of them as societies rather than as society publishers. We keep using this phrase, society publishers, as if publishing is the main thing they do. For me, a society is a community of scholars. It's a group of people who are interested in research, who do various things. One of those things is circulating knowledge. It might not even be publishing. It might be some other form of dissemination. It might, theoretically, it could be running an archive or a platform or something else. It might not even be a journal in the future. But I find it so challenging to think about how those small groups of scholars who aren't primarily publishers and who aren't au fait with all the many changes going on, they're the people who need help. Perhaps people like Rachel's organization in the US, perhaps another consultant going around in the UK, who knows what it's going to be. But otherwise, I fear that the small societies are going to end up taking the path of least resistance and going to work with the big players, because I think they can, the advantage, their societies have very rarely done their own typesetting and printing and paper making. They've always worked with external service providers, and I'm sure they always will, because at heart we're academics and researchers, not printers, typographers, XML workflow people, whatever it happens to be. And the question is to work out which services we need and from whom we should get them, and how we can make those decisions without more help is, for me, a challenge. And I think that thinking about societies as groups of scholars, rather than assuming that they are primarily publishers, should help to refocus the minds a little bit about what sort of help groups of scholars need to make these choices.
That's great, and maybe we actually just need to all step back and say, what is scholarship in the 21st century, and what does that look like, and how does it affect? And I just want to end with a comment from Alicia, who said that actually transformative agreements could put small societies with maybe one journal out of business potentially, if it's just made very easy to go with these big transformative agreements with major publishers. So there's a lot to tackle here. We've had some fantastic questions. Thank you very much. We will put up the other webinar, Martin's webinar, as in our recommended reading list on this webinar. Martin's and John Walensky and Oya Rigo, if you want to look at cooperative funding models. We'll also have a discussion about how we can perhaps answer more of these questions, and we'll certainly collect them, and if I can persuade all the panelists to answer the questions directed at them, we can perhaps put that up and make that available as well. And this is a topic we will definitely be returning to, because I think it's fascinating, and we want scholarly societies and disciplines of practice and communities of scholars to help us. Thanks very much. So thank you to all our panelists for taking time, and to our many participants. We've still got more than 100, and it's overshot. So thank you everyone for coming. And the next one, look out, it will be in October. Bye for now. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.